Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. The 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly convenes on September 15th. And this year, the General Assembly will be held virtually for the first time ever due to the coronavirus pandemic. UN documents released prior to the General Assembly indicated that North Korean issues are put on the agenda of this year's gathering. Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un issued a dire warning for the country's economy, adding that the country is forced to reconsider its economic projects. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining us is Robert Manning, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was Senior Strategist to the Director of the National Intelligence and served at the Department of State on the Policy Planning staff and as a Senior Counselor for Energy, Technology, and Science Policy, advising on North Korea's nuclear program. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Young-Kyo.
Happy to be here.
The issue of North Korea's denuclearization will be revisited at this year's General Assembly. Under the current circumstances, how will it be discussed? Is there any other way than urging North Korea come out to the talks? Mr. Manning, could we start with you?
Yeah, I think it's important for the UN to reiterate its opprobrium for North Korea's behavior, but I think it's fairly clear that North Korea has no interest in renewing negotiations aimed at dismantling their nuclear program at this time. And so I think it's of limited utility, but it's not unimportant.
And Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I have pretty low expectations for the UN General Assembly to get very much accomplished, especially in a virtual format. This was supposed to be a significant symbolic year, the 75th anniversary of the founding. But I think it's going to be very hard for progress to be made in terms of reaching a consensus on denuclearization, not only because it's a virtual UNGA, but also because of the political context coming right before the U.S. presidential election.
Mm-hmm. In conjunction with this, the international sanctions on North Korea will likely be on the agenda. Do you expect to hear the calls among the UN member states to ease the North Korean sanctions? And how will the United States respond to this? Mr. Snyder?
I expect the U.S. is probably going to want to continue to emphasize maximum pressure, but I think that there is room for a revamp in the approach to sanctions. Some sanctions that have been imposed through the UN Security Council resolutions are not terribly effective, and now North Korea has pursued 2 to 3 years of sanctions evasion, where they've essentially gotten around the intent of the sanctions. And so I think that we could step back and reevaluate and essentially try to shore up some of the enforcement holes while also relieving pressure in areas that might actually be counterproductive to our interest in bringing North Korea back to the table.
Uh-huh. Mr. Manning, your view on this?
Yeah, I couldn't disagree with that. I think there are two elements to sanctions. One is to demonstrate the rejection of any legitimacy for North Korea's nuclear program. The so-called maximum pressure has actually not been either one, neither maximum nor pressure, because the North Koreans are very skilled at evading sanctions through a whole variety of means, not least cyber theft and ransomware, where they've earned hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think reassessing them is not a bad idea. I think in the U.S., sanctions are everybody's favorite policy when we don't know what else to do, but they are rarely looked at. 2, 5, 6 years later, have we changed anyone's behavior? Maybe we ought to rethink them.
The General Assembly decided to continue its examination of North Korea's human rights situation at this year's session. And North Korea has been reacting strongly against the UN bringing up the human rights issue. Shouldn't the UN Security Council deal with this head on in order to really press North Korea on human rights, Mr. Manning?
Well, yes, again, it's important that the world make it clear that the horrendous human rights situation in North Korea is unacceptable, and that the world is paying attention and focused on it. But for North Korea, when the word human rights says to them regime change, and they were not going to change their behavior. But nonetheless, I think it's important to keep the heat and the light on what they're doing, because it's absolutely horrendous when you look at the percentage of people that don't have food or not enough food, the tens of thousands they have in detainment camps and so on.
The UN Security Council should be discussing the North Korean human rights issue, but it's essentially impossible over Chinese and Russian objections. And so in the past, I think the formula for dealing with this was to have an informal session of the Security Council. That happened for a couple of years after the Commission of Inquiry report came out back in 2014. But since the advent of summit diplomacy, the U.S. has simply not taken leadership on this issue at the UN. And it is something that we need to take back up at this time.
Mm-hmm. And this week, a number of news media reported about Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward's upcoming book, Rage. And through those reports, some contents of the letters from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to President Donald Trump were revealed. What do you think these letters tell about President Trump and Chairman Kim's relationship? Mr. Snyder, your view first.
Well, the letters were fascinating, really, and I think that, one, it shows that North Korea and Kim Jong-un have had a pretty good understanding of President Trump himself in terms of trying to shape and flatter the ego. In fact, one thing that is very striking, I think, with the switch from Fire and Fury to letters is that there's an ego-stroking competition between Kim Jong-un and Trump. But I think that what the letters also reveal is that summit diplomacy concentrating on Kim and Trump is particularly potentially dangerous. And so we really need to widen the aperture and re-engage at other levels and in other forms between the two governments.
Some of Kim's advisors must have had a lot of fun drafting those letters. And I suspect that, to me, it suggests a really condescending view of Trump, that he could be easily manipulated. And they weren't entirely wrong. But it's also true that, both, as Scott mentioned, you had these two competing egos. And I think, especially in Hanoi, both Trump and Kim thought they could persuade the other, and they were easy to manipulate, and the result was it was a total failure. So I think it really raises questions about the idea of this kind of summit diplomacy that has, unless it has been preceded by careful staff work and a game plan for how to proceed and how to follow it.
And according to reports about Bob Woodward's book, in 2017, U.S.-North Korean relations were fragile, and the potential for nuclear war was on the mind of the president's national security staff, including former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Were the U.S. and North Korea actually on the brink of war back then, Mr. Manning?
Well, the scariest thing is even Secretary of Defense Mattis and the National Security Council advisors didn't know if Trump was serious. And that's a dangerous situation. I think he loves unpredictability, but this is a dangerous situation when we're talking about nuclear war. And I think that the fact that the people executing his order, who would execute his orders, really were not sure whether this was a bluff to scare Kim Jong-un or not, is a really disturbing idea.
Mr. Snyder, do you share Mr. Manning's view?
Yeah, I agree with that. But what I would also point to is that this was probably the most dangerous confrontation between nuclear adversaries since the Cuban Missile Crisis, except that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had communication between leaders. In 2017, we didn't. And now we have this Trump-Kim relationship but it's all been so personalized that we're actually at potential risk of returning to a communications breakdown between confrontational parties, potentially within months, depending on how the election comes out.
Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said that due to the unexpected damage by typhoon, the North Korean regime cannot help but change the direction after comprehensively considering the year-end tasks. Chairman Kim specifically mentioned that restoration of the Gumdok area is important. What is the significance of this Gumdok area to the North Korean economy? Mr. Snyder first.
Well, Kumduk, it's my understanding it is an area, it's a mining area. It has a lot of magnesite ore. Magnesite has been an export item for North Korea, and it is also used for domestic construction in the cement industry. And so if they've, so it basically hits both potential exports and it hits in terms of North Korea's domestic production goals. And so that is, and the fact that the North Korean leadership is prioritizing it, I think, underscores its importance perceived importance from the North Korean leadership's perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's an enormously important mining complex. There's also lead, zinc, and importantly, rare earth materials that are used in telephones and so on. And they were completely flooded in this typhoon. So that wiped out a really important segment of their economy, both internally and in terms of exports. So I think there's a real sense of crisis in North Korea, but because it's so opaque, we really have a hard time grasping the magnitude of it and what the internal dynamics are.
North Korea even skipped holding a celebratory event for the day of the country's foundation, which fell on September 9th. How difficult is the situation for North Korea right now, Mr. Manning?
I think this is really the worst situation since the famine of the 1990s. You have these typhoons that are wiping out arable land, mining, and you have the border closures because of COVID, and so 90% of their trade comes through the border from China. So their economy, by most projections, is supposed to shrink somewhere in the 10 to 15% range this year. So I think, and it's also interesting that Kim has refused to accept aid. I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm sure it has something to do with the internal dynamics, political dynamics within North Korea. And of course, on top of that, Kim has apparently had some sort of illness, and over the last year or so, we've seen the rising profile of his sister, Kim Yo-jong, as if they're preparing her to be accepted in the event that something happens. So, we have all these moving parts going on, and it's very hard to understand what it adds up to.
I agree that North Korea is facing economic hardship, and the biggest example of that is that it has impacted some of these national political loyalty celebrations and demonstrations, because those really are paramount objectives and priorities for the North Korean state. And so for those to be interrupted, I think does suggest significant problems. But I think there's also a silver lining to the typhoons, at least for North Korea, because it kind of takes Kim Jong-un off the hook in terms of the completion of the Pyongyang hospital that has been a publicly announced objective for October 10th. Given the immediate impact of the typhoons, I think that he now has space to miss some of the goals that had been identified for the 75th anniversary of the party founding on October 10th.
Mm-hmm. As the country was battered by the natural disasters, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ordered to rebuild damaged homes and railways by October 10th, when the country is set to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the Workers' Party. We'll have to watch whether North Korea will be able to weather through the storm, which has brought further damage to the country's economy, already hit by the international sanctions and border closures amid the pandemic. Mr. Manning and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.